press have gotten in, but they've always been arrested and had their film confiscated. And in July of 2000, I snuck in and shot some hidden video, the only video to ever get out of the Grove.
How did you manage to sneak in?
I basically came to the main gate and crawled down through the swamp and then went up and got into the main parking area where they have these big open backed trucks that come in and take the members in. And I basically just climbed on to the truck with some other members, had a conversation with them, and then they stopped us at an internal checkpoint, and some security people climbed on asking us what group we were with, and I knew enough about some of the club's names inside to tell them I was part of the Hillbillies, which is the Texas delegation, the Bushes and their friends.
And your accent worked.
And yeah, I gotta say, you kind of look the part.
So Alex Jones actually sneaks into Bohemian Grove with a video camera, and he shoots the footage of what he saw. Legally, we're not allowed to show it to you because he broke the law in obtaining it, but I've seen it, and it is pretty compelling stuff.
You were in there?
Oh, the whole time. And I basically just sat behind a building on the grass for the next 2.5 hours or so, and then as it got dark, I then went out to witness the cremation of care ritual.
I'm wondering why you wanted to get in there in the first place.
Well, I had begun to research Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones at Yale. Bohemian Grove is where they all get together.
People love blaming things on Skull and Bones. The rumors run rampant about the legendary secret Yale fraternity. They've been accused of stealing the bones of Geronimo, Pancho Villa, and even our 8th president, Martin Van Buren. But none of that has ever been proven. The club taps members of the Yale junior class to join its ranks, and past members have included William F. Buckley, John Kerry, both Presidents Bush, and of course, the late President William Howard Taft.
And it was William Howard Taft, the president, who came here to the Bohemian Grove, who of course was the high-level Skull and Bones member, who first began to talk about a world government, a League of Nations, which was then picked up a few years later by Woodrow Wilson. And so this whole system is their plan for a world government, and it is based on a Germanic death cult. And you've got all these world leaders and all these powerful people together before they have the ritual beneath these giant redwoods in this huge Hall of the Mountain King is what it's like. It's scary.
You're talking about a new world order. You're talking about a big conspiracy about these people getting together and talking about stuff that's going to basically bring us all down, and we're still here.
I know the direction these guys are taking us in is undemocratic. You've got all these CIA directors, attorney generals, vice presidents, presidents.
Going to the Grove.
You have the former German chancellor, Helmut Schmidt. He says, we have our own druidic groves in Germany. But my favorite place to go, and he calls it druidic, is Northern California.
Groves have held a sacred place in the lore of Druids for centuries. This mysterious order of Celtic priests have performed both human and animal sacrifice in their groves in ancient England. And historically, similar orders, Romans, Greeks, Scandinavians, also all consider groves to be sacred spaces.
What happened once the ceremony began?
It was so creepy. I had snuck in, I'd seen the 40-foot stone owl. I'd seen the black altar in front of it during the day. Then as it got dark, to watch over 1,000 prominent people march down the little pond in front of this idol, and then to see the ritual unfold from there, I was thinking one thing: get the footage and get out of here.
Some of the wealthiest and most influential men in the country are meeting to discuss some of the biggest ideas, not just in America, but worldwide. Are they making handshake agreements? Come on. I don't think U.S. presidents are meeting in secret to plot against us. But I do believe that there are people out there who would benefit from hanging out socially with a president. So the question is, how far would those people go? California investigating the Bohemian Club. In the year 2000, Alex Jones actually managed to covertly record the cremation of care ceremony. Anyone could have busted him any second. It reminded me of that scene from Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where the non-body snatchers are trying to blend in with everyone else. When he gets to the spot where they do the cremation of care ceremony, though, it suddenly gets real dark. It's a scene that looks like a crowded amusement park at night. You know, when everyone's standing around shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the fireworks to start. As the ceremony begins, people are dressed in what look like long robes, like a monk would wear. They're carrying flaming torches. They start walking on and off some sort of stage set in front of this giant owl.
What are we seeing here? I mean, it looks like a cross or something?
That's a person, it's a herald. And he's saying, "For behold, here is Bohemia's shrine, and holy are the pillars of this house." This is their temple, these redwoods. And while all this is going on, a black carriage comes out, an old-fashioned hearse led by horses, and there's a body in effigy there. The owl is saying there's only one goddess that can help us, only one true deity. And they bring fire, and then the owl starts speaking to them, saying, "You've got to burn dull care," and it's an effigy of a child-sized human figure. So then Care says, "No, you're not," and a thunderbolt is thrown down.
And what looks like a comet shoots through the air and at the stage. Alex says it was an elaborate pyrotechnic show, and that was it. That was the cremation of Care ceremony. And I can tell you it looks no better, no cooler than what they have in a fraternity, but just with really good pyrotechnics.
So this is part of the pyrotechnics.
And yes, and then the owl starts speaking and said, "Listen, you gotta give me that effigy, you gotta burn it right now, and I'll take care of all your problems."
A word of caution here, and this may be the most important thing I say in this entire episode. It is very dangerous to try to interpret something from the outside.
Now, the copy of the record of the insurrectionists provided to David's staff in the secret cases from the insurrection include the Bohemian Grove human sacrifice arrangement, where they, according to the narrative, conducted their contracts to the War on David on the basis of sacrificing a prince in order to validate their the generic evils that they were going to do, at which point they would be purged of all of their sins, paying the equivalent price, as a sacrifice is the forfeiting of value to the deity in question, at which point the more valuable the sacrifice, the higher security or protections from the deity in question, at which point their sacrifice of David Bulls as the legend of David in the system generates that covering, at which point it is either that proper or it is a subversion narrative. Either way, David's character had been connected to the Bohemian Grove system, which had actually happened from the record according to the surveillance technology used by judges often to engage in extra legal investigations. In the scenario where it is not the function of the direct Satanist sacrifice, it would have been the compromising of that sacrifice by their ignoring of the order to have the weavers leave their weaves before they enter the grove, signifying that they renounce the sacred nature of the relationship in the grove, generating their exchanges, as they, being the ones compromising the thing, would be the ones destroying the functional purpose of the grove for the others who, having to keep the secret, have been betrayed by the double agents using it for the extortion mechanism. Now those who are engaged in the subversions, either for the grove's god or for the Satanist proper, either way, it comes to the same conclusion that the manufactured Satanists are engaged in the Confederate coup against the United States. In both scenarios, there is the possibility of it being the service to their functional, specific factional god, but in both cases they're doing the same things, so there is no legal difference between it, despite their false justifications on the basis of their religious practices of the state-compelled religion, and the separation of church and state being dissolved by the compelling of the religion on the general public from the human sacrifice system, generates one of many extreme violations at the top to commit the most amount of crimes and generate the most amount of liability at the functional worship of the Hitler and Hitler's youth functionally being generated as a byproduct inside the infection for the United States, including the character for Jordan Peterson's character, who, using these types of programs, has the position of engaging in the false science, which is false experiments like the prisoner's paradox, where if you have a bunch of prisoners, will they naturally treat innocent people abusively, which isn't the function from the study, because the study shows that the prison guards, knowing that the innocent parties are innocent, were still abusive, isn't an arbitrary nonsense, but it is a compulsion by the general system, at which point the state of authority, with another experiment where ordinary people were told to electrocute someone for giving a wrong answer on the basis of them simply having authority, generates the compliance to the subject, at which point the non-violent force compelling the paradox of their compliance to the assumption of authority would be the position, at which point the activity is not the study, the activity is the use of the Nazi training, and the child soldier program for the Nazi training generates their malicious troops for their KKK terrorist campaigns, at which point you have the cover of secrecy legitimized by the government for the mass training through the government for Nazi troops against civilians in secular civil war to overthrow the republics by the torture, harassment, and terrorisms of the KKK by those under those functions, such as the MK Ultra and COINTELPRO programs, mixed with the Terror Factory dynamic, where the aspect of the FBI being loyal to the United States is disqualified, as the Terror Factory would be invested in for the utilization of the damages or the blackmail, at which point it becomes the religious sacrifice of compromising the targets, who are the study, and the study is the creation of Nazis from normal people, under the belief that people in Nazi Germany were not different to anyone else. They were just regular people. There were ordinary men, and those ordinary men were compelled into the radicalization of Nazism by these social components, rather than an inherent error inside themselves, at which point these Nazi training camps are constantly enforced by the surveillance system, and anyone who compromises it is actively punished, at which point the false assertion of secrets is actively an act of war. These systems are criminal insurrection, and their abuses against David and the others are systematic treason, sedition, and high crimes in its proper category, by the reduction of status as a war crime amongst the others, in order to engage in the defamations, which are derived by having a lower, or being treated according to a lower class than you are, generates the ability to say the norms of the lower class upon convenience, which would not apply without their use of force, as the higher class does not have those functions as a serviceable norm, servicing their constant recycle of defamation, which is not the act of them making fun of the targets, but the act of engaged in malicious abuses and harassments, which have no serviceable connection to a joke. As there is violence connected to the subject, it is not benign, and thus they are not jokes, qualifying the use of their religious practices of the training and manipulations for the psychology to mature to the full realization of the infecting virus, which goes into a cell and uses the base reproduction cases or materials inside of the cell in order to reproduce itself until it destroys the cell and explodes it into the mass-produced egglings of the infecting virus, at which point the infecting virus is the Confederate Nazi system, which they are functionally reproducing through these false experiments, such as the Bohemian Grove religious zealots, and mixing with the Satanists generates their ability to engage in their religious functionality as the Druids, for the KKK is functionally founded inside religion, and the manipulation of or corruption of religion creates the inferior non-desirables who would normally associate in the KKK, who are given the Warlock Pact for the promotion under the ability for them to service the larger collective interest, and are paid the importance by the money laundering, which allows them to acquire the illusion of a legitimate advancement as payment for their secret services, at which points their promotions and contracts and book deals, etc., would be payment for the alternative function, at which point all they have to do is jack off something, and you have your laundering system in question, which increases the viability of the drug cartels which have been infecting Northern California, as they are an active aspect or servants of these types of systems directly and indirectly, and as dark money and Phantom Cell's secret connections are all secret and not on the books, there wouldn't be a history of their correlating records, but they are working in unison, at which point the intelligence agencies have historically found criminal organizations or outside organizations in order to engage in their various coups, especially in Central and South America, which by definition means they are consistently promoting the black market functions as funding for their other endeavors. So the servants of these functions, such as the cartels in Northern California, would be the subjects of the religious radicals using the intelligence apparatus, as they have the power and position over the intelligence apparatus. They're able to coincidentally use both at the same time, generating their control over the system as they're infecting California, their enemy, until the reproduction of the radicals in question gives them a significant enough militia in order to completely dissolve publicly the Republic of California and the other states which they are attacking, at which point they already, as an enemy of the state governments and the federal governments, generates the aggressions, still having to put up with the existence of the government, are merely conducting the facade of their connection to it while conducting the religious rituals until such time as the virus reproduction from the RNA of the cell is able to reproduce enough viruses to destroy the cell in question, at which point there would be a public acknowledgement that there would not be any functioning republics in question, and thus people would stop pretending to have any kind of connection or relevance to the government, as the government would have been officially collapsed. It's important to understand that the power of the satanic and the devils are actively legitimate and real for real life, but the problem is most of them are primarily contained outside of their influence with their human conduits, who, being able to use technology such as the nerve hacking systems with the government and the agents who worship them, then they are able to make the connecting systems in order to compel the functional force, despite their specific limitations, by the bridging system, at which point that bridging system allows for the satanic to return under the original orders systematically dismantling all of the barriers that would have originally barred them into a certain realm or limitation from their effects against the humans. At which point, these arrangements which they're building is a Satanist ritual. It is demon worship, and they are real. And many of the technologies in the terrorist operations, such as their ability to conduct surveillance inside properties or houses, have weaponry effects, such as the attacks against auras. Now, everyone has energy that surrounds them. Their brains and nerves function by conducting electricity or energy, at which point you're going to have the encircling aura of the magnet, the levels of attraction, like the magnetism's gravity barriers, at which point the aura of the magnetism generates your normal functioning health, at which point their ability to counter that electric signal generates a state of sickness, and that state of sickness weakens the person, at which point the reduced health of the person allows them easier access to engage in the various rituals from the demonic, engaging locally, which allows for higher influence to the systems which they have actively been studying in their MK Ultra Satan worship terrorist operations, at which point their witchcraft societies are actively taking the demonic and improving them, engaging in the Roko's Basilisk of the demonic, at which point anyone who is not in compliance with their Satanist agenda would be actively destroyed in the forming of the one world government under these technologies, which engaged in the mass expansion and use of those technologies systematically traps the general publics into these systems by the various tricks and illusions and traps, such as false morality. And the function of false morality allows them to feel comfortable and confident in promoting abject evil, at which point the person who abuses you because they're malicious can be convinced that they are being malicious and that they're doing something wrong, and the person who is punishing you because they think they're doing something good for you does so with the consent of their conscience, at which point you have these delusional psychopaths who are actively promoted in those positions to conduct these various abuses, weakening their targets to the demonic, at which point the demonic, having more influence from the weakened auras, generates larger systematic injuries of various kinds based upon whatever it is they're actually capable of performing. At which point you have the Satanists who are actively pursuing the demonic in these strategic applications of war against the humans, at which point the functional desire of these Satanists seeking the one world government want to form the mark of the beast, which once somebody takes the mark of the beast, they're no longer able to be forgiven and accepted by God, which is the functional definition of them not having a soul, at which point they are no longer human. And the function of them having destroyed their soul and not having humanity left are perpetually stuck in that negative cycle, at which point the days of Noah, it says that their genes were polluted and that Noah was found to be holy or separated from the pollution, at which point the genetic tainted lines not applying to Noah allows for the humankind's reproduction, as opposed to the corrupted genes, which are the natural reproduction desire of the Satanist society for the replacement of humanity with the demonic servants. At which point you have these systems systematically destroying everyone by these perpetual skirmishes, and their investment into the corruption is the devotion of these arrangements, at which point they are by definition anti-human and seeking the destruction of all other human souls, at which point it is a genocide of specific peoples strategically, but also the purpose of attacking those people is the dismantlement of securities so that they can destroy the rest of them, at which point it is a war against humanity. It is a catastrophic, apocalyptic, genocidal, devastating event, at which point those who are not functionally suicidal have a natural compulsion or obligation to protect themselves and their families, etc. And the only way of doing so is destroying all of the advances made in the War on David in order to categorically restore the securities natural to humankind, which are actively being targeted, at which point it is an actual functioning act of suicide for anyone to side against David under the original title, as he was projected under the targets of being necessary to American security under those positions and not loyal to the Satanists would have blocked the Confederate insurgencies and their production of the demonic advancements, at which point it is suicidal to not fully push the full endorsement and acceleration of myself and other key members who have been removed as targeted individuals under the assaults and defamation campaigns for the lies from the illusions derived by the collection of POWs for abuse, which allows them to be exhausted into something convenient to be able to lie about them, at which point the defamations become viable when they are not able to defend themselves competently from the exhaustions, from the consistent use of them being exhausted by the battles in question, at which point the consistent assaults and abuses and extortions and exhaustions implementing the war allows for the socially convenient answer of the distraction, which allows them to implement the rest of the strategies against the collective community on a primary war strategy of collateral damage, at which point collateral damage is not an inconvenience, it is the direct objective. The removal of the security by the use of high collateral damage weaponry, such as biological weapons, engages in the destruction of the collective community with the most destruction towards human interests, at which point their frauds are accepted to the destruction of those who comply with the War on David in other criminal subordinate programs, generating their own destruction as a suicide bombing. Now, whatever deal with the devil you made, whatever Faustian bargain was arranged, I guarantee you the price was insignificant, at which point them getting paid to conduct their suicide mission ahead of time, as is normal in all suicide bombing arrangements, means they are themselves directly paid before their self-destruction, and their families are paid before the self-destruction and after the self-destruction under the promise, at which point they only have to pay them as long as people directly connected to them are able to observe them paying the thing, at which point the confidence of being able to pay the insurance or willingness to pay the insurance is the only thing that validates the continuation of their insurrectionist procedure. At which point you have the KKK terrorist operations and their black market funding consistently promoting these systems, including the systems of the pre-existing corruption from the general society and its abuses, at which point those who have systematically been able to get away with abuses would be contracted to be replaced under the position that they, having been able to successfully conduct those abuses, means the same procedure and the same mechanisms under the same authorities would still consistently hold up, at which point the intention is the mass corruption of the systems in order to promote those arrangements, which arbitrarily being discovered from the arbitrary creation generates the ability of the KKK to use it as a platform for the enforcement, at which point they're paid their suicide terrorist money or profits or arrangements, including the black market arrangements and benefits such as the rape culture, the Plato's conspiracy, but without the philosopher kings, engages in the black market so that they can buy the permit for the rapes, at which point the full compliance with the system allows for the romantic relationships tolerated so long as it is within the barrier and time stamps of the permit, at which point when it expires it dissolves back into a state of nature, at which point eventually the party affected by the rapes becomes sober and is capable of leaving after the expiration dates and their sobriety, at which point you have the duration of the contract plus the duration of their hungover state, at which point you have the systematic abuses against women in order to keep them stuck in those scenarios, which have the ability to increase the hungover duration, at which point the rapes contracts no longer being in effect still require the girl to be able to leave, at which point the longer and more difficult it is for them to leave, the bigger the problem, at which point they trade that problem which exists with the Feminist Incorporated, which generates their abuses against men in general as a retaliation, at which point after the permit the magic doesn't protect them, and if they didn't have a permit the magic doesn't protect them, and their retaliation against the general injury allows for the collective corruption to catastrophically collapse the total law system, at which point there is a dissolving of the collective order until everyone has engaged in their political identity and their various factions, engaging in their terrorist insurrections against each other as the weapon by the Satanists against the general public is the destruction of their community. The advantage is highly desirable in the local, but that local restriction of the use of that weapon is the destruction of the local area in general, weakening the collective system. By their consent in secret to engage in those criminal extortions and destructions of themselves, as they, shooting upon their own communities, have destroyed their own communities, is the general arrangement, and it is preferred for the Satanists that they have permission to conduct their crimes from the communities they're wishing to abuse, at which point you have a system of a suicide bombing culture by psychopaths seeking the eradication of all humankind, wittingly and unwittingly, at which point a large strategy generated would be the system of preferring a series of mechanisms of gross negligence where they know to not finish the thought, at which point they start engaging in an excuse for their position, which dissolves once they finish the series of logical chains, which they know to avoid, at which point they rudely dissolve the conversation whenever it stops serving their interests and it starts going into the disillusionment of the argument for the collective understanding, at which point this would actively socially be engineered into them, allowing for their intentional destruction of themselves without knowing the gravity of their crimes, without removing an ounce of their culpability. Now, with this compliance, you have such various cons as to have them happily comply with the confirmation and validation of their own morality of these arrangements, and their rejection of their worship of God or various religions in favor of their knowledge and dedication on the use of the illusion from the human technologies, at which point their worship of technology and their rejection of the gods of their fathers is the system which is fundamental to the Satanist ritual or the Antichrist ritual, which they're seeking to implement against myself and many others. They want to create the capturing of many of these systems, such as the churches, and the devotion of those who are willing to increase the viral infections of gain of function viruses which have been produced in labs in order to increase spreadability and infection for the collective quarantining and destruction for the genocides and the war camps. Upon maturity, allows for the systems of actively blocking medicines necessary for the production of the protection of the general community, and this being conducted by many, including those inside the church, are devoted to the suicidal tendency for the express purposes in their specific arrangements and delusions, at which point churchians aren't Christians in that function. Going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than being in a garage makes you a car. The function of being a part of those organizations do not help you on your spiritual development, and if they have been captured, then they are functionally serving Satan through their Druid religions, at which point you have many of the old school 1800s, 1900s con artists which engage in many misdirections and frauds, which allows for the collection of resources, which is basically just an illusionary system or entertainment schedule, at which point they have the appearance of godliness without its power, and their complete rejection of God's power is the position of not having the Spirit, and their position of not having the Spirit means they were allowed to be deceived by themselves on purpose by the Satanists in order to engage in the destruction of their body and their soul, including the spreading of the diseases for the war crimes of the Civil War, of the Confederates overthrowing the states and leveraging the captured states to make war under the false legitimacy of the authority of the state for targeted statelessness in the anarcho terrorist insurrection through their KKK militias, which are being bred and promoted and trained and developed for the systematic conquering of the collective societies through an espionage war, generating the secret collapse of the total organism, at which point they, engaging in the larger collapse of the systems from these major wizard frauds, generates their Great Reset, which the Confederates want to use. Whether or not the Great Reset is used for evil is derived by their compliance with their war on David and the Confederate insurrection in general, at which point, if the Great Reset had not had the intention of being evil by itself, it would be corrupted and destroyed and overthrown by the evil by having not had the proper security mechanisms necessary in order to have protected themselves from that system, at which point their devotion to order is the derivative of their evil, at which point the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and if they do in fact have good intentions, then it is irrelevant if they are willingly vulnerable to the Satanist insurrections behind the War on David programs, at which points they have to decide for themselves if they do or do not want to destroy the entirety of humanity.